Audio started. Do we want to wait till right at 6:30 or do we want to go ahead and start? Okay, it's 6:25. So give it 6:30. Okay. Because you have a quiz. How very okay, but the hail doesn't start. I'm not sure. No one calls it awesome. Hey everybody, we have a nice full house. Great to see all these people. I am Joyce Coleman. I'm the retired Baptist professor of medieval English literature from University of Oklahoma. And I had many occasions over my career there teaching various kinds of Tolkien stuff and the stuff that Tolkien got, to make the Lord of the Rings and all that. So it's really exciting to have found another Tolkien expert in Oklahoma. So Dr. Cami Agan is a distinguished university professor of English at Oklahoma Christian University in Edmond. She's a member of the Medieval Academy of America, the Modern Language Association, the American Society for 18th Century Studies, and the Society for Utopian Studies. Dr. Agan's academic specialization is in J.R.R. Tolkien's work, particularly the First Age materials in his Legendarium. And if you don't know what First Age materials would be, or Legendarium, you will find out. But it's the stories at the back of the Lord of the Rings and so on. Dr. Agan's 2024 anthology is Cities and Strongholds of Middle Earth. It explores how Tolkien's First Age cities and strongholds function as makers of meaning, containers of relations, outposts of history, and evocations of the past. Dr. Agan.
I'll try to juggle PowerPoint and actual paper, see how it goes. Thank you so much to the Medieval Fair Free Lecture Series and the University of Oklahoma's Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a real honor, and I'm excited to be a part of a larger public conversation that involves those with an interest in things medieval, or in the case of my talk tonight, medieval and medieval adjacent. Like many medievalists of my generation, I came to the field through my love of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whose works I began reading in middle school. Although I did my PhD in 18th century drama, in 2008 I returned to my first love, medieval literature, and more specifically Tolkien's works. As many of you may know, Tolkien was himself a medievalist and a philologist, interested in the interconnection of early medieval languages, such as Old English, Old Norse, Finnish, Icelandic, Welsh, and Gothic, a form of Old German. The literatures in those languages, particularly Beowulf and the Norse sagas, were the focus of his teaching and scholarship. His critical essay from the 1930s, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, for example, is still important to the field, and scholars still reference it quite frequently. He was among a group of academics who saw early medieval literature as worthy of not just linguistic or archaeological interest, but of great literary value as well. The works that Tolkien himself created, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, questionable, are of course not themselves medieval, but instead they're set in the pseudo-medieval world he called Arda, where Middle-earth is located. Indeed, Tolkien's works are excellent examples of a curious subfield known as medievalism. Works created after the medieval period itself, but infused with what the author sees as the flavor of medieval works, pre-industrial, enchanted, heroic, and inhabited by creatures known to us through medieval or folkloric works, elves, dwarves, wizards, and the like. Other popular examples of medievalism include the book and television series Wheel of Time, Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels, the Game of Thrones novels and HBO series, the common Norse Viking imagery in popular culture, and even medieval fairs like the one in Norman. Medievalism aligns well with the fantasy genre, and most people identify Tolkien as the literary great-grandfather of that genre that has continued to grow in popularity. For both Tolkien and later authors, the fantasy genre constructs a mythic or imagined medieval past, but it can't help also having some elements of the author's more modern era reflected in it as well. Tolkien's particular brand of medievalism possesses a more complex or layered quality than many of the works I've referenced, thanks to his day job as professor of Old English at Oxford and his general specialty in medieval literature and languages. Simply put, he had to know the medieval works and their languages better than most fantasy authors because his profession required him to have that knowledge and to teach those works. His world building contains direct influences from the medieval works he studied, taught, and knew well. And they even contain languages that Tolkien invented based on his delight in medieval languages like Finnish and Old English. Some examples of this borrowing directly from medieval sources. There's an episode you may know in The Hobbit when Bilbo Baggins steals a cup from the sleeping dragon Smaug. Smaug realizes this theft and reacts violently. This is a direct allusion to a similar moment in Beowulf when the theft of a cup awakens the sleeping dragon. That will bring disaster to Beowulf and his kin, spoiler alert. Although quite different in tone, The Hobbit winks at those who know the early poem by echoing the theft of the cup. The names of the dwarves in The Hobbit are also not original to Tolkien. He borrowed Durin, Nori, Dori, Ori, Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, etc., from the Elder Edda, a Norse saga from roughly the 10th century. Tolkien's invented Elvish language, Quenya, which later split into several different languages, is based on Finnish, a language that fascinated Tolkien and that marked, to some degree, his turn from classical language study, Greek and Latin, to northern languages of the Germanic peoples. In addition to these obvious connections or allusions to medieval works he knew well, Tolkien also took influence from the more recent past's reinterpretation of what they considered medieval. For example, Romantic poets like John Keats, who wrote many lyric poems set in a kind of medieval fairyland of enchantment, pre-Raphaelite artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who painted medieval Arthurian scenes, Victorian fairy stories like Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, or William Morris's romances and his work with the Norse Elder Edda. Thus, while Middle-earth has echoes of the 8th century actual medieval works like Beowulf, it also has 19th and early 20th century imaginings of what a medieval past might have been. If you're interested in this later influence, Dimitra Fehmi's book, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits, is a great place to start. Over the last 20 to 25 years, Tolkien studies as a scholarly discipline has expanded and developed exponentially. Societies such as the American Mythopoeic Society and the UK's Tolkien Society welcome academics, independent scholars, and fans to their conferences, which involve formal presentation of papers, chat rooms, cosplay banquets, bardic circles, crafting and baking groups, and book rooms. This year, the Tolkien Society is hosting its first event in the USA, Westmoot in Kansas City in May. and its theme is Tolkien in World War I. It will take place, not surprisingly, at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. And I'm going to give a paper there on tombs in Middle-earth, which I'll talk just briefly about later. The US-based Mythopoeic Society has recently announced that their conference for 2026 will be in Weatherford, Oklahoma, where the archive of the society is held at SWOSU. Both of these groups, the Tolkien Society and the Mythopoeic Society, also sponsor in-person and online reading and creative writing groups throughout the nation and the world, which brings a strong sense of community for anyone interested in the works of Tolkien and other fantasy writers. Although not all members are medievalists or interested in the medievalism that Middle-earth evokes, most understand Tolkien's debt to medieval literature and languages. More formal academic conferences, notably the Medieval Conference in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and the International Medieval Congress at Leeds, UK, have added numerous medievalism panels to their docket. For example, several panels and roundtables focus on Tolkien studies and on the recent reappropriation of Viking imagery in political circles, among others. I have given papers at Leeds for the last 3 years where Tolkien had his first academic appointment at the university, and where some of his early archival material, primarily his medieval academic work, remains for study. Recently, universities such as the University of Glasgow in Scotland have pioneered centers for the study of fantasy and the fantastic, training their graduate students in the exploration of medievalism like Tolkien's Middle-earth, as well as in the fantasy genre more generally. These conferences and centers have spawned peer-reviewed journals where academic and independent scholars can publish their research, as well as numerous publishing houses such as Bloomsbury, McFarland, Kent State, Mythopoeic, and Walking Tree Press, which specialize in Tolkien-related book-length studies. Interested, passionate, and highly knowledgeable fans and scholars enthusiastically acquire, comment, and participate in these conferences, join the societies, and buy the books and journals that focus on Tolkien. The most recent format for Tolkien studies is the podcast, and there are several podcasts out there whose content focuses on Tolkien's Middle-earth in some way. I've just chosen a few. Among the most popular is Loving the Alliteration, the Prancing Pony podcast, which reads through The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, and offers commentary and conversation about various moments in the works, from scholars, fans, and everything in between. They have a spin-off podcast, The Rings of Power Recap, that discusses in depth each episode of the Amazon Prime series. The Athrabeth podcast features interviews with authors who've recently published on Tolkien, as well as philosophical issues in Tolkien's world. Queer Lodging's podcast discusses fan fiction, fan art, and Tolkien's work from the standpoint of queer studies. And so while that may not be for everyone, its very existence and success reveals how popular and influential his work has been to almost every potential audience. Now that we've situated Tolkien in the field known as medievalism, what kind of work are scholars doing with Tolkien's world? To give some idea of the scope, I've broken the field down into some categories, although often people combine several of these areas in their work. For simplicity's sake, the major areas are, firstly, source studies. Scholars here examine medieval, classical, biblical, romantic, Victorian, modernist, or other areas whose works might have served as inspiration to Tolkien's world building. Those who explore Tolkien's sources often parallel characters, episodes, textual passages, and even language patterns that they see echoing some previous source. Biographical studies, these are investigations into events, people, and places in Tolkien's life that influenced or encouraged the creation of his world. Some important avenues here include Tolkien's British identity, his Roman Catholic faith, his participation in World War I and its resulting traumas, his academic career and professional associations, particularly with the all-male Oxford group known as the Inklings, which included another famous British Oxford professor and writer, C.S. Lewis. A large part of the biographical sources we have come from Tolkien's letters, and an authorized biography, which in my opinion is in great need of updating. The next one, canon worthiness. Here, the canon refers to the generally agreed upon works that belong in or are considered vital part of a group, such as broadly British literature, or more narrowly Romantic literature of the 19th century, for example. For Tolkien, scholars have attempted to make the case that Tolkien belonged or did not belong in the canon, in English literature classrooms as a topic of scholarly study. This impulse was frequent, especially early in the Tolkien studies era, 60s and 70s. This kind of analysis usually tries to confront the popularity of Tolkien, which can sometimes be a detriment to works coming into the received canon. Probably the most famous work in the field is Tom Shippey's J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century. This kind of defense of Tolkien has largely fallen out of favor, which I'll explain a bit later. Linguistic analysis. There are some specialists interested only in Tolkien's invented languages, particularly in the various versions of Elvish that Tolkien developed through the decades. Because one of Tolkien's fields was philology, the study of the interrelation of languages, he developed and created a history of those languages that increases the sense of complexity in his created world. Linguistic scholars trace the changes or development in Tolkien's languages, and there's even a journal specializing in Tolkien's world-building languages. Literary analysis, we're home for me. Critics here detail central themes, patterns, and structural meanings in the text of Tolkien's world. These scholars often apply critical lenses such as world building, narrative theory, gender studies, colonial and imperialism, disability studies, and the like, to the text and world of Middle-earth. Trained as an English professor myself, literary studies is the area I work in, and that I try to train my students in as they researched and developed their papers, which are due next week. And finally, cultural studies. These critics expand our understanding of what Tolkien is to encompass film, television adaptations, fan fiction, fan art, medieval fairs, gaming, cosplay of Tolkien's characters, and even the examination of those who seek to sanctify either Tolkien himself or the events within the world of Middle-earth. Because cultural studies claims that any cultural product reflects something important about that culture, it has solved to a large degree the problem of an author being too popular to be important to academic study. Any cultural product is worthy of study. Now that we have a general idea of Tolkien's position in medievalism, his growing popular and scholarly community, the methods scholars use to analyze his work, and before I discuss my particular work in Tolkien studies, first I want to map out very generally the history inside Tolkien's world. So some of you nerds will know this already. Tolkien wrote accounts that stretch as far back as the creation of his world, and his work survives in complex layers of manuscripts, revisions, and genres. Generally, though, we can break the history of his world down into 3 ages. The first age, the best age. This age unfolds from the creation account to the awakening of the peoples of Middle-earth, elves, dwarves, and humans, through the creation of the great jewels known as the Silmarils, and finally to the defeat of Morgoth, the evil supernatural being who sought control over all the world. If you think Sauron from Lord of the Rings was evil and powerful, Morgoth was his master and the first being to fall into evil. Tolkien's posthumously published work, The Silmarillion, 1977, contains the most well-known versions of the First Age tales. Centered mostly on the elves, Tolkien began writing about the First Age as early as 1917 while serving in the war, and he never stopped writing, revising, and developing ideas from the First Age until his death. The Second Age focuses mostly on the island realm of Numenor, where humans reach their artistic and political height only to fall when they begin to resent elves their immortality. Desperate to live forever, they fall under the sway of the evil seducer, Sauron. Sauron had already been up to no good in Middle-earth, helping the elves forge powerful rings. Sauron himself secretly forges the One Ring, yes, that One Ring, in an attempt to dominate the others. After the destruction of Numenor, the few survivors come to Middle-earth and help the elves defeat Sauron. The ring is lost until a certain hobbit-like creature comes upon it centuries later. The Amazon Prime series, The Rings of Power, focuses on the Second Age. But interestingly, Tolkien wrote the least about this age, a kind of dark age of Middle-earth, as he called it. The Third Age. Tolkien's most famous works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, are set in the Third Age, as are Peter Jackson's wildly popular film adaptations. This age features Tolkien's invented peoples, the Hobbits, and the final defeat of Sauron at the hands of these unlikely heroes, as well as the fading of the elves from Middle-earth. Although the Third Age features Tolkien's most popular works, he began working on them much later, 1936 to 1955, and worked them back into his earlier ages as he revised for publication. The Lord of the Rings only exists because his publishers called for a sequel to the 1937 The Hobbit. It probably won't surprise you to hear that a large majority of scholarship in Tolkien focuses on the last age, the Third Age, and the events of The Lord of the Rings. Ever the contrarian, however, I write and work almost exclusively on the First Age materials, as I call them, the tales and events that predate The Lord of the Rings by millennia. Between 1977 and 2019, Tolkien's son Christopher, his literary executor, published 12 volumes of additional material, which we refer to collectively as the history of Middle-earth. Much of that additional material expands, revises, and offers differing versions of tales from the First Age. Of particular interest to me are the volumes Morgoth's Ring and The War of the Jewels, which add philosophical and other layers to the ancient First Age accounts. Let me offer some more detail about the First Age and some patterns that interest me in my research into those ancient times. The First Age primarily emphasizes elven perspectives. Tolkien's elves are the firstborn in the world, and in the First Age, they are the center of and crafters of the narratives. While they are always associated with art, beauty, aesthetics, lore, and wisdom, in the First Age, they are also quite a mess. They have their fall, they commit violent acts against their kin, they are exiled back to Middle-earth, where they establish kingdoms and get into even more trouble. Warrior ethos. This term is not unique to Tolkien. It refers to a societal organization of often early mythic tales, also Beowulf, which emphasizes the relation between feudal lords and their followers, with an emphasis on heroic battles, enchanted spaces, and valiant deeds. This ethos also values exchange of loyalty, treasure, and artifacts such as armor, swords, and other objects of power. A primary characteristic of every warrior king, to reward his faithful retainers with treasure and praise. A primary characteristic of every warrior of the king, unswerving loyalty and glorious death in battle, defending that king. Elegiac tone. Elegy is a mode usually found in a poem that celebrates or hallows something or someone that has died. The tone of elegy is thus melancholic and stoic, with an awareness that all things, especially beautiful and noble things, must pass away. Because the elves of the First Age and later the dwarves and humans who ally with them can never defeat the powerful godlike being Morgoth, their heroic and valiant deeds are always in vain, and their mighty kings and strongholds are all doomed to fall. As a result, the First Age tales are always pausing to note the passing of something or someone, even as it praises their heroic actions. And finally, more women and women doing things. A famous critical observation about The Lord of the Rings is that there are more horses with names than women. But in the First Age, despite what you might assume about stories glorifying warrior culture, there are many women with central roles in the action, including one of my favorites, Luthien Tinuviel, an elf who is powerful enough to defeat Sauron in magical combat. These elements of the First Age, warrior ethos, elegiac tone, and active, powerful, and magical women, all also characterize many of the medieval texts that Tolkien knew well. So his medievalism borrows these elements and folds them into his world building and the tales inside that world. In addition to these characteristics that attract me to the First Age, I have particular critical interests that partner well with the themes and narratives of Tolkien's works. And so that's the last two on this slide, maps and cultural geography. One of the earliest elements of Tolkien's world building included the drawing of maps, the placing of names into certain geographies, the indication of topography and strongholds or leaders within that topography. Cultural geography, the study of human interaction with and involvement with the natural world, becomes an intriguing lens through which I can read various events of the First Age. The tales of this age foreground geography and human or elven interaction with it through exile, a return to Middle-earth, and the founding of political and social spaces and alliances. This interest in elves' relation to geography in the First Age led to my first book, an edited collection called Cities and Strongholds of Middle-earth. Tolkien's maps are an interesting example of medievalism as well, because although they seek to represent the medieval-esque world of Middle-earth, they actually resemble modern maps far more clearly than they do medieval ones. The next slide makes that clear. On the right, you see a 13th century map of England by Matthew Paris, a Benedictine monk. On the left, you see Tolkien's map of First Age Middle-earth. It's clear that he and his son Christopher, who helped draw the maps, find inspiration from their contemporary 20th century experience with map making, rather than an overt attempt to replicate a medieval map itself. This map shows a before and after of part of First Age Middle-earth. The top map charts the region known as Beleriand, where most of the action of the First Age takes place. The bottom map reveals the results of the War of Wrath that defeats the evil Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Despite the unlooked-for victory, much of the landscape on which the elves fought their valiant battles now lies submerged under the seas. The loss of that landscape and all of the cities, strongholds, tombs, and sites of memory now exist only in tales. This sense of loss, not only in the passing of mighty warriors, but in the loss of the land itself, develops what I've begun to call a hyper-elegiac tone to the Silmarillion. I've been working on a larger project, hopefully to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Silmarillion in 2027, that examines the hyper-elegiac tone and insights into those First Age accounts. How do tales reach this level of elegy? Specifically, it's the way the tales retell the loss of peoples and places. It involves the combination of constant attention to names and places, as on a map, and the occasional reminders of the inevitable loss of the landscape itself that, in my reading, intensifies the effect of elegy. The events are in the deep past, the brave figures have fallen, their tombs raised and hallowed, but there is no returning to these places to celebrate or to mourn, because they are now drowned under the waves. To close, I'll just give one example of the kind of passage that interests me. This passage details the loss and burial of a mighty elven warrior. Luthien and Beren buried the body of Felagund upon the hilltop of his own isle, and it was clean again, and the green grave of Finrod Finarfin's son, fairest of all the princes of the elves, remained inviolate, until the land was changed and broken and foundered under destroying seas. The passage opens with a recognizable elegiac tone as it explains the burial of Finrod, a great elven warrior and prince. As is appropriate to warrior culture, the survivors bury the fallen and honor his sacrifice. In the enchanted realm of Middle-earth, even the landscape itself honors the dead, as the grass grows over his tomb and wards off evil. Despite the defeats to come, the passage informs us that the space remains inviolate, resistant to the evil that is fated to overcome the elves and their allies. Then the passage adds yet another layer of elegy, reminding its readers or listeners that the tomb, the isle, and all the lands of Beleriand will disappear and finally founder under destroying seas. The only method the inhabitants of Middle-earth have to remember this elven king are the tales and the retelling or preserving of those tales. It is only in the retelling that the inhabitants of Middle-earth can mourn his loss. I'll be discussing this technique of hyperelegy in the Silmarillion in my paper for the Westmoot Conference in Kansas City, so there is much more to say here. I'll close, though, by encouraging those interested in Tolkien to join one of the societies and enter into our community of medievalism. We welcome everyone curious about Tolkien and his world. Thank you so much. I think there's plenty of time for questions.
Could you talk a little bit about the conference here in Oklahoma? Is it SWASU you mentioned?
Yes. Well, it's early days yet, but it'll be most of the time the first weekend in August, a great time to be in Oklahoma.
Indoors, I hope.
Yes, it's usually a hotel now. They used to rough it and stay in dorms, but I think now they've realized hotels are better. And it's usually a 3-day affair, and it's a combination of, academic papers, independent scholars giving papers, and then at night they have bardic circles where people sing, perform their creative works. They have a big banquet where there's all sorts of hijinks going on, which I won't go into details, but that's when they have their pageant where people can dress up if they want to. And it's the Mythopoeic Society, the US-based conference, that's hosting it. And it just so happens that the people who run it are called stewards, which probably makes sense to Tolkien people. One of them is the archival librarian at SWOSU, and so that's part of the reason it's located there. So if you go to mythsoc.org, Mythopoeic Society, you'll soon be seeing some shameless plugging, but what they've started doing since COVID is doing on-site and then an online alternating. So this summer it will be online. And that conference is only $20 to attend online. Mm-hmm. And the subject is women in Tolkien, because this is the 10th anniversary of the first anthology focusing on women in Tolkien's works. Perilous and Fair is the name of that anthology. So it's usually a really good way to plug in to that group. Any other questions about that?
When it's on site, how many people are usually there? How big is it?
150, 200, I would say. And it depends on the location. It might be less, sorry, Okies, with Weatherford. But it might mean more local people come, which would also be great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's called Perilous and Fair, is that correct?
The women anthology, yeah. Mm-hmm. Perilous and Fair.
You mentioned something about queer studies in relation to Tolkien's works, is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you circle back to that?
Yeah, absolutely. The podcast is called Queer Lodgings. So that would be a good place to start. And the two of the people that are involved in that are also involved in the Mythopoeic Society. Alicia Fox-Lenz is one of the speakers. And so what they often do will explore particular passages, mostly in Lord of the Rings, but in other of Tolkien's work, and just use a queer lens. So obviously, if you know Tolkien, Queer Lodgings is the name of a chapter in Lord of the Rings. And in the first part of Fellowship of the Ring, there's a lot of references to things being queer, which then sort of open up this space. There's also a lot of work that's been done on the nature of homoamory, which is not necessarily homoerotic, but not just homosocial. So what is going on with Frodo and Sam, for example, is sort of a wide possibility of interpretation, which the text supports to a large degree. So that's often people's opening, entry into that discussion. Obviously, Legolas and Gimli is. But the first stage also has these ships, right, that the fans have created of various relationships between characters who form warrior bonds of some kind. And then 21st century readers are looking back at that through the queer lens, which is pretty exciting stuff. I like to tell my students, if you're reading it as a person who's LGBTQ and you see yourself in the text, like that's a great thing, right? And so you want to read more, you want to see more, and you want to be in conversation with others as well. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I remember some time ago now, there were sort of arguments or problems between the children or the children of Tolkien and who could get how much money out of which whatever.
Yes.
And what was going on there and how does it stand now?
Well, and I know this usually, secondhand, because I'm not important enough to be in contact directly with the estate, as they're often referred to. They're extremely protective, right, of Tolkien's works, and that's why fan fiction can only exist right out there on the web, and no one can make money off of it because they will come after you. There was quite a bit of discussion revolving around Rings of Power. And from what I understand, they got several ideas pitched to them, and they went with the one that they thought would be the most lucrative, rather than the one that scholars and fans were saying might be the best. So that's a little bit disappointing, to say nothing of what I think about Rings of Power. So it feels like with the death of Christopher Tolkien in 2020, there has been a lot of, no one knows who's in charge, basically. As far as if you make a request as an outside person for access, you're not sure who you're dealing with. And I'm not sure that that's completely settled in the family either.
Would that be a descendant of Tolkien who's in charge?
Yeah.
Do we know who that descendant is?
I do not know who that is at the moment, and when you try to access that on their website, which is extremely archaic, you don't find an answer. I do know Dimitra Feeney, who I referenced, and she does have direct contact with the family, so I could get that answer for you. I just don't know.
Oh, I'm not gonna try to.
But didn't Simon have a lot to do with the Rings of Power information?
Yeah, so he would be a grandson, and Christopher Tolkien, of course, had everything, right? He was a literary executor. He passed so recently. His widow is alive, and then the last child of Tolkien passed a little bit later than that. And so after that, that's about 2022, I think, when she passed. Things have kind of been settling. So from what I hear, there's been some question about whether Bailey Tolkien, the wife of Christopher, is in charge now, or if it's back to a direct descendant, Simon, etc. And I think they're trying to figure that out themselves. Yeah, but it's good news in that we've had a couple of examples of adaptations that have been very successful, and some diehard fans love them. Some don't, but it's creating conversation, and I think that's a positive thing. I haven't seen the Rohirrim one yet, though I'm looking forward to that. Maybe once grading is over. That'll be my gift. I'm waiting for a prestige HBO 4-year, 14-episode first stage Silmarillion. So if you know anyone.
That's gotta be a fan fiction, I think.
Yeah, well, they're out there for sure.
I teach art history, so the pre-Raphaelites are my interest, and I know more about them than Tolkien. But what was the connection? Was there much? Because it's interesting about the map making, because it seems like it would have been a great opportunity to have maps. Do they have like dragons and things in any of their maps, and any of the that would have come from some of these medieval maps?
The Hobbit map in particular,
Yeah, that
right,
one.
has
That one I remember.
Smaug on there. And there are two maps in that text. One is the map that actually exists in the world that they use. And then one is at the beginning of the novel. And you see the dragon drawn on them. And in some of the newer publications, you see color as well. So the dragon is red.
That's what I was wondering.
And the lettering is red,
Yeah.
So there's been a couple of articles. I think one of them is in Mythlore, which is the free access journal of the Medievalistic Society, on Tolkien's fixation with long hair, and this is across gender. He spends a lot of time discussing like fantastic, beautiful, long, golden, amazing hair, and being tall. Those two things are like for him. And there's a great article that connects that to pre-Raphaelite painting.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, how
very much
the
like that.
paintings would have been an inspiration.
Yeah.
It's also Anglo-Saxon, the long blonde hair.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And he was an Anglo-Saxon.
Straw heads, as they are called.
Sorry, I was gonna have to pay attention. I didn't quite hear what you said, and I was more curious about it. So you said that at the end of his books, he would often create more like a 19th century kind of realistic version, and then amongst their characters, they would have like a more, to their world, to their technological abilities, like a map that would have been more medieval in nature.
We don't have that, so we don't know. All of the maps that are extant, again, the estate has them, and so you can only see them through publications, or if you went to one of the expositions recently, you could see them. They all are clearly 20th century maps. The exception would be sometimes there are drawings, but there's like the north, south, east, west, right, orientation, all of those things clearly show late 19th, early 20th century influence rather than medieval. But I like your idea that inside the world they may have looked somewhat different, because we know in Elrond's home in Rivendell, there's a lot of scrolls and lore, and they look at them because when Merry and Pippin are wandering around before they meet Treebeard, one of them, I forget, I get them confused still. He has looked at a map and he knows the name of the river, and he explains like the topography of where they are. So it's clear that they exist in the world. Yeah. So that's a really interesting idea. Go. No. Yeah.
So I thought I was curious about the long hair. Doesn't Galadriel's hair literally contain the light of Valinor?
Well, I mean,
Is that or the
yes, I think all of her contains that, right?
Yeah. What's the significance of her gift?
Well, again, this takes me to the first age, again, always. In some of the backstory of the first age, the ultimate bad boy, Feanor, who is related to Galadriel, he requests some of her hair to inspire his creation, and she reads him and says no, turns him down, which is like unique in the world. So when she agrees in the Rivendell sequences in Fellowship of the Ring to give 3 strands to Gimli, it's like a big deal. But anyone reading Lord of the Rings initially, right, in the late 40s, early 50s, they would not have known that. So that was just like a little thing that at the time Tolkien was doing for himself. He was rewarding inside the text this less important person who was genuine, right, rather than garbage boy Feanor. Some of you will argue that's fine, but he had issues.
So is that like the entire thing with him getting the 3 strands of hair, is that she gives it to him because he just doesn't understand like the volume quite of what he's been given, or to him it's just special because like she's really pretty and it's really pretty hair?
Lots of different interpretations of that. He's exhibiting some real courtly love behavior in that sequence where he's adoring her, worshiping her, and she responds from something of a pedestal, but she responds and acknowledges his genuine passion, and she continues that really throughout the rest of the Lord of the Rings. So it's not really resolved. Celeborn seems fine with it. He doesn't do much. So you can view it that way. There's a lot of Marian readings of Galadriel that she evokes a sort of Blessed Virgin, Queen of Heaven sort of idea. That's not really my reading of it, but I can understand it. I can understand why people would have it. So daring to ask there is something really interesting instead of demanding. But it feels like she kind of knows that because she doesn't have anything for him in the gift sequence. And so she's opening the door for him to ask that, since she can sort of see inside him. So, I don't know. It's interesting. Is there an erotic charge? Maybe. Maybe it's only one way. Yeah.
So as a professional, how do you stumble your way into this field?
Yeah.
Because I didn't even think that it was a possibility, and now my interest is piqued.
Good. I have to
Yeah,
say
great
the news.
I've read the Silmarillion at least 6 times. So
My child. Yeah. I mean, as I said at the opening, it was just like a fan thing initially, right? As a young person, as many of us here, that was my entryway into Beowulf and right that world. But I started seeing some interesting articles. I don't remember, Angela, when you had the class with me, but it was, early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I taught my first Tolkien class as an undergraduate elective. And I basically went with my fan knowledge. And that was when I realized, like, wow, it's really been building up over the last 15 or so years. And there are people doing some really good work. And what's nice now is that a lot of that work is open access. So you don't even have to have an academic affiliation to access the journals and kind of see what's out there. Journal of Tolkien Research is another one that's all online. And they have peer-reviewed articles, but they also have articles that you can just post. Like I could post this to get it out there to everyone, or if you have a conference paper, they have a special like line that you can just post it there. And a lot of people do that because they just want their ideas to be out there. So those are two good places to look. You also don't have to be a medievalist anymore to become a Tolkien scholar. That used to be the route. But now people who didn't know about Tolkien before Peter Jackson's films are Tolkien scholars, right? There's any number of avenues to that. But we need more film scholars, so keep at it. I think that the difference between the two texts obviously is the tone, right? It's more elevated. But as I guess I revealed at the end, I'm really fixated on the name and place locations throughout. There's a whole chapter in the middle of the text, which again, Christopher organized and put in order. So do with that what you will. That's called Of Beleriand and Its Realms, and it's just literally a listing of names and places and people who live there, and everyone's just like, I'm like, I love it. So that's where I really plugged into it. So we need more. We need more scholars of the first age for sure. I just started a new anthology process, co-editing with Claire Moore, who is a young up-and-coming scholar, called Women and Gender in Tolkien Studies. So it's the 10th anniversary of Perilous and Fair, so we're like, what's going on now, what's new? So that's going to involve queer, non-binary, fluid, speciesism, like all the different stuff that has been sort of fomenting over the last 10 years. So, jump in, basically.
What do you find much value in the index of the history of Middle Earth, as far as looking at looking up words? I mean, when it originally came out, they said this is just for people doing scholarly work on this, and I didn't pick it up at the time to be part of the collection because but it's like now I'm missing it on my hardback original. So but is it as useful as they said it would be? Because I mean, they got indexes in the back of all the individual books.
Yeah, I tend to use the individual ones.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, I don't need that.
We have a group of the reason why Leeds has been so vital to me is that there were already a group of Tolkien scholars there who were connected with each other and had a community. And the community is called Sodom, the Society for the Obtaining and Drinking of Mead. And so at Oklahoma Christian, I have to be very careful about throwing that terminology around. But we have our own drive where somebody was given that to review as a scholar, and so it's there in the drive for me. But I tend to just open up Morgoth's Ring and look in the back of it rather than look at the one index.
Yeah, I recently finished that one now on World Tools. So. Yeah.
Those texts get very philosophical. Unfortunately, Tolkien in the late 60s decided that the flat Earth idea was wrong and he was going to redo the entire cosmology. Fortunately, he passed before he wrecked everything. That's a real problem with the later stuff, is that he's trying to really mess with the cosmology that he established. So I just kind of pretended it didn't happen.
Have you picked up a copy of the Nature of Middle Earth? Mm-hmm. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, if you like math, the first half of it is for you. That's another sort of fixation Tolkien got later in life, is figuring out the age of actual elves and how long they could have lived and how long the gestation period is for elven women.
It got ridiculous.
Dozens of years, and working out the math for that. But then the second half has got some really interesting stuff about dancing bears in Numenor, for example, which I hope to see on Rings of Power.
That'd be interesting.
If they don't have dancing bears, what are we even doing here?
How old was he then? You said in the 60s? How long?
He died when he was 80. 2-ish in 73, so late 70s.
May I ask a
Of course.
personal opinion question?
Uh,
As a first age scholar specifically,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on the Rings of Power series?
It's
okay if the answer is it's complicated.
complicated. I mean, I don't want to be aligned with the people who are like, we don't want a brown elf, like all of that hate. So I feel like defending it for that reason, because it's getting bashed for reasons that I think are ridiculous on that side. It's just making stuff up like willy-nilly, and that's fine. You know, that's fine to a certain degree, but there are some weird choices. I feel like it's more, and I'm not an expert, it's more filmic problems and pacing problems than it is the lore being wrong. Like, I'm not sitting there with my copies, you know. But when you're trying to get the Numenor story, the Galadriel story, the Arondir story, it's too much to do in an hour episode, and then they try to do that in every episode. I think the Hobbits are really interesting, but the pacing there just absolutely kills every episode for me. They said goodbye to each other for like 14 minutes. The first season, I'm just like,
Too slow in some
that's-
parts and too fast in others.
yeah, and that's just knowing how TV works, which I don't know that well. But clearly it seems like they don't either. The Mormon nightgown scenario is also like bizarre. But when they finally started doing some things, I thought the way they handled Celebrimbor's seduction was also problematic, because there's a lot of language in Tolkien's work that is erotically charged between Sauron and Celebrimbor, who made the rings. And they just completely avoided that completely and used a woman elf as kind of the beard between the two of them. But I did like that he saw a different reality than was actually going on. If you know the second season, I really thought that was an interesting way of doing it. So I have, you know, things that I like, but I try not to look at it from a lore perspective, but just more like, is this enjoyable? And it's, you know, B-C, I would say. I don't like to tear stuff down. But sometimes, like when Galadriel didn't say Finrod's name for like 8 episodes, but my brother. I was like, just say his name, you have 4 or 5 brothers. I just thought that was weird, and then I started thinking maybe they don't have permission to use his name.
Right?
Because they only have certain access to certain parts of the texts. So I go back and look, and they did. So I don't understand that choice. But the Numenor stuff I really, really like. I love the production design there a lot. Tolkien referred to that nation and even Gondor as a kind of like Byzantium. So they're picking up on that quite a bit, and I like that. So, that's not too personal. I didn't name a child after a character. Some of you are not so lucky. I have had students named Elrond before, so it's always awkward. It's like, I see you. They go by their middle name usually. Anybody else? No? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming on a Friday night. And no storm.
Oh, I have it. How many books have you got in your collection?